Greetings, quiet chroniclers of history's truly disturbing jobs. Forget Hollywood villains. The life of a medieval torturer was a daily grind of agony, screams, and, frankly, a lot of bodily fluids. It was less a career and more a perpetual gruesome performance. Being a torturer back then, it sucked so spectacularly your worst Monday feels like a spa day. If this morbid dive tickles your dark, funny bone, do the noble thing, like and subscribe. As we settle into this misery, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it? Now, let's begin. When we picture a medieval torturer, our minds conjure a familiar, dreadful image. He's a hulking figure, his face hidden by a black hood, his silhouette framed by the flickering torchlight of a stone dungeon. We imagine him with a cruel, cackling laugh, a monstrous sadist who takes profound, almost artistic pleasure in the screams of his victims. He is evil incarnate, a villain from a fairy tale, driven by a deep-seated malice and a love for human suffering. This is the torturer of Hollywood and horror novels, a symbol of pure, uncomplicated brutality. He exists to be hated, a one-dimensional monster who makes our skin crawl. But this caricature, as vivid and persistent as it is, obscures a far more pathetic and miserable reality. The truth is, the man behind the mythical evil laugh was likely more pitiable than powerful, and his daily existence was a grind of grime, not glee. Let's peel back that mythical hood and look at the real man underneath. He was almost certainly not a hulking sadist, but a beleaguered functionary. Far from being a powerful figure, the torturer or executioner occupied one of the lowest rungs of the social ladder. He wasn't a master of his own dark domain, but a municipal employee, a grim tool wielded by the town council or the local lord. His job was not born of a desire to inflict pain for pleasure, but from a procedural necessity within a brutal legal system. He was a cog in the machine of justice, and his role was defined not by malice, but by a chilling, bureaucratic mandate. The miasma of the dungeon was not just the smell of fear and filth, but the stench of his own low status, a permanent stain that followed him long after he'd wiped the blood from his hands. This was a job, and a truly terrible one at that. To understand the torturer, we must first understand the legal system he served. In the later Middle Ages, the concept of justice was deeply intertwined with the need for proof, and the queen of proofs was a confession. Without a confession, convicting a suspect for a serious crime was often impossible, regardless of other evidence. This created a judicial paradox. How do you get a confession from someone who refuses to speak? The answer was judicial torture. It wasn't random violence. It was a sanctioned, and in their view, necessary step in the legal process. The torturer was the technician tasked with this grim procedure. He was permitted to work only when a judge had established a half-proof, such as a single eyewitness or strong circumstantial evidence, and was then authorized to extract the required confession. He was in essence a state-sanctioned interrogator, his methods just another part of the paperwork. This gruesome occupation was rarely chosen. Instead, it was often inherited, a grim legacy passed from father to son. In many parts of Europe, particularly Germany, the executioner belonged to a class of people known as unehrliche Leute, the dishonorable people. This group included professions tainted by death, waste, or perceived sin, such as gravediggers, knockers who disposed of animal carcasses, latrine cleaners, and pimps. Because no honorable person would willingly enter such a trade, these roles became hereditary by default. A son was born into the profession, with no hope of becoming a baker, a blacksmith, or a merchant. He was trapped by his surname, his future dictated by the social stigma attached to his father's work. This wasn't a career path, it was a life sentence. The social consequences of this dishonorable status were profound and suffocating. The torturer and his family were utterly ostracized. They were vital to the function of the state, yet reviled by the community they served. They were often forced to live on the literal margins of society, in isolated houses on the edge of town, frequently near the gallows, the dump, or the brothels they might also oversee. They were barred from entering churches, joining guilds, or drinking in the same taverns as their neighbors. When they went to the market, other shoppers would shrink away, shopkeepers might refuse their coin, their children were bullied, denied schooling, and unable to marry into honorable families, forced to find spouses among other outcast groups. They were phantoms in their own communities, necessary evils made to be invisible. The role of torturer was rarely a full-time position because, thankfully, its services weren't needed every day. To make a living, he had to perform a whole portfolio of unsavory tasks that no one else would touch. He was the town's chief executioner, responsible for hangings, beheadings, and burnings. He was the local knacker, tasked with hauling away and disposing of dead or diseased livestock. He was the dog catcher and the man who had to clean the cesspools and public latrines. In some towns, he was even responsible for overseeing lepers and prostitutes. This grim collection of duties, all associated with death, disease, and filth, reinforced his unclean status, making him the living embodiment of society's underbelly. Each task further deepened the social moat that separated his family from everyone else. So what was the compensation for this life of gore and isolation? It was a mixed and miserable bag. An execution itself might pay well. A single beheading could earn what a skilled craftsman made in a month, but these events were infrequent. The real perks were grim. He was often exempt from taxes and tolls, a small mercy. He might be entitled to the clothes the condemned person was wearing at the time of their death, a macabre bonus he could clean and sell. He was also under immense pressure to be proficient. A botched execution, taking too many swings of the sword to sever a head, was not just unprofessional, it was dangerous. It could be seen as needless cruelty, enraging the assembled crowd who might attack him on the spot, or it could lead to him being fined or dismissed by his employers. He had to be a master of a craft no one respected. Finally, we must consider the unseen wound, the psychological miasma. Imagine the mental burden of a life spent inflicting agony and death, not out of rage or hatred, but as a simple, repetitive job. While medieval sources are not filled with psychological profiles, the detailed diary of one 16th century executioner, Franz Schmidt, reveals a man deeply concerned with piety and honor, desperate to have his family escape the stigma of his profession. Modern studies of those involved in capital punishment show high rates of PTSD, moral injury, and depression. The medieval torturer was no different. He was a man forced to suppress his own humanity to perform his duties. The true horror of his existence was not the cackling laugh of a movie monster, but the silent, internal scream of a shunned man, trapped in a waking nightmare of society's own making. Let's talk about career choices. In the grand tapestry of medieval professions, you had the noble knight, the skilled artisan, the devout priest, and the hard-working farmer. But what of the torturer? Where did this figure fit? It's safe to say that professional agony inflictor wasn't a top choice on the career aptitude test, even by the bleak standards of the Middle Ages. No child dreamed of growing up to operate the rack. No young man aspired to a life of state-sanctioned cruelty. The very existence of this job begs a fundamental question. If the role was so reviled, so socially toxic, who on earth ended up doing it? The answer reveals a world where the concept of choice was a luxury few could afford, and some career paths were not chosen but brutally assigned. To begin, we must discard the cartoonish notion of the willing sadist, the man who gleefully seeks out a profession that allows him to indulge his darkest impulses. While it's impossible to deny that some individuals may have derived a twisted pleasure from their work, this was not the norm. The role of the torturer was a bureaucratic necessity, a grim function of the state. Society needed someone to perform this ugly task, but it simultaneously loathed the person who did it. Therefore, the position was filled not by eager volunteers, but by those who had no other recourse. It was a career for the desperate, the damned, and the doomed. It was the ultimate dead-end job, in every sense of the term. The men who filled this role were trapped, cornered, by a society that needed their services but refused them its respect. So how did one find oneself walking this miserable path? History shows us there were two primary grim portals through which a man entered this profession. The first was the prison of birth, a life sentence of inherited shame where the trade was passed down from father to son. The second was the gallows bargain, a desperate pact made by a condemned criminal who chose to wield the instruments of death rather than fall victim to them. Both paths led to the same destination, a life of profound isolation, psychological trauma, and social damnation. Neither path involved a meaningful choice. It was a journey that began with either a cursed name or a death sentence, and there were rarely any exits along the way. The hereditary path is rooted in a concept central to medieval and early modern German society, unerliche Leute, or the dishonorable people. These were professions tainted by their association with death, sin, or filth. This caste included knackers who disposed of animal carcasses, grave diggers, latrine cleaners, and of course, executioners and torturers. To be dishonorable wasn't a moral judgment in the modern sense. It was a formal social classification. It meant you and your family were barred from guilds, from holding public office, and from most forms of social interaction with the honorable citizenry. This rigid social structure created a closed loop, a self-perpetuating system of inherited stigma. This system of dishonor made the torturer's trade a family business by default. Imagine being an executioner with a son. No honorable master craftsman would ever take your child as an apprentice. The boy would be turned away from the baker, the blacksmith, and the weaver, his surname a brand of contamination. Conversely, the executioner couldn't find an outside apprentice willing to take on the family's crushing social stigma. The only person he could train to succeed him was his own son. The role became a trap passed down through generations, a grim heirloom that no one wanted but no one could discard. The family was chained to the profession by the very society that shunned them for it. The apprenticeship itself was a horrific upbringing. A young boy would learn the family trade not in a workshop but in a dungeon and on the scaffold. His father would be his mentor in the arts of death and pain. He would learn the precise mechanics of the rack, understanding how much pressure to apply to dislocate a shoulder without killing the prisoner. He would be taught the anatomy required for a swift, clean decapitation with a heavy executioner's sword, knowing that a botched job could lead to a riot. He learned to manage the jeering crowds, to remain impassive in the face of screams, and to handle the grim aftermath. It was an education in calculated violence and profound emotional detachment, taught by the one person he was supposed to trust. Consider for a moment the psychological reality for that child. While other boys were learning a trade that would build up their community, he was learning a trade that terrified it. He would see the fear and hatred in the eyes of his neighbors and their children. He would come to understand that the tools in his father's shed were not for creation, but for deconstruction of human bodies. His own name would become a source of shame, a word whispered with dread in the village square. The dawning realization of his future, that this life of blood, screams, and isolation was also to be his, must have been a source of unimaginable despair, a childhood stolen by a predetermined fate. This wasn't a theoretical problem, it was the reality for entire dynasties of death. The most famous is perhaps the Sanson family, who served as the state executioners of France for 6 generations, from 1688 to 1847. They were state officials residing in Paris and carrying out the sentences of the king and, later, the Republic. They were responsible for the executions of figures like King Louis XV, Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre. Yet despite their official capacity and the grim importance of their role, they remained social pariahs. They were a family trapped in a paradoxical position of civic duty and profound public revulsion, passing the sword and the stigma from one reluctant generation to the next. A more intimate perspective comes from the diary of Meister Franz Schmidt, a 16th century executioner in Nuremberg, Germany. Schmidt, who executed nearly 400 people and tortured hundreds more over his 45-year career, inherited the profession from his father. His writings reveal a man who was deeply pious and viewed his work as a necessary God-sanctioned service to justice. However, his life's primary ambition was not to be a better executioner, but to have his family's name restored to the honorable rolls. He eventually succeeded, petitioning the emperor to grant his children freedom from his tainted profession. His story provides a rare, personal glimpse into the profound internal conflict of a man who did his horrific job dutifully while desperately seeking to escape its shadow. The family name became an inescapable brand. Even if a son tried to flee his fate by moving to another town, the professional network was small. Word would travel, or his past would be discovered, and the doors would once again slam shut. The name itself was a cage. Because of this, marriage was another reinforcing chain. The son of an executioner could not marry the daughter of an honorable baker. He had to find a spouse from within the same dishonorable caste, often marrying the daughter of another executioner from a neighboring town. This practice further concentrated the stigma, weaving these families together into a closed, isolated lineage of outcasts, ensuring the profession's continuation. Now let us turn to the second dark portal, the gallows bargain. What happened when a town's executioner died without a son to succeed him? This created a crisis for the local authorities. The wheels of justice, however brutal, had to keep turning. Executions were scheduled and torture was a required part of ongoing investigations. With no honorable citizen willing to volunteer for the reviled position, the magistrates had to get creative. Their solution was often to look towards the condemned cells, finding a man who already had nothing left to lose. They needed a new monster, so they decided to make one. The offer was as simple as it was diabolical. A criminal, convicted of a capital crime and standing at the foot of the gallows, would be given a last-minute choice. He could proceed with his own execution, or he could take up the executioner's tools and, in exchange for his life, become the town's new agent of justice. It was a pardon that was also a life sentence. He could escape his own death, but only by agreeing to a life dedicated to inflicting it on others. He would live, but as a social leper, a ghost in his own community, forever marked by the terrible bargain he made to survive. Imagine the psychological torment of that choice. In that moment, instinct likely takes over. The primal biological urge to live, to draw one more breath, is overwhelming. So the man agrees, he chooses life, but in the moments, days, and years that follow, the weight of that decision would begin to crush him. He chose to live, but at the cost of his social identity, his past, and perhaps his very soul. He was now the thing everyone feared, a walking symbol of death. Every sneer from a former friend, every person who crossed the street to avoid him, every sleepless night would be a reminder of the bargain he struck, a pardon that felt more like a curse. The cruelty of the authorities often did not end with the bargain itself. A common practice for sealing this deal was to make the newly appointed executioner's very first task the execution of his former friends or cellmates. This was a brutally effective strategy. It immediately and irrevocably severed the man's ties to his old life and criminal underworld. It proved his loyalty to his new masters and demonstrated to the public that he was no longer one of them. It was a baptism in blood, a horrific initiation designed to psychologically break the man and remake him into a tool of the state. Unlike the son of a torturer who grew up learning the trade, this man was a complete novice. His first time holding the executioner's sword or operating the Strappado was live, with no room for error. The terror must have been immense. A botched execution was his worst nightmare. An unsteady hand could turn a swift death into a gruesome spectacle of mangled flesh, enraging the crowd and inviting their wrath. He could be stoned, beaten, or run out of town. He had to learn on the job, a job where every mistake was measured in blood, and his own survival depended on his ability to master a craft he never wanted. Ultimately, whether born into the blood-soaked smock or forced into it at the last second, the result was the same. The path to becoming a medieval torturer was not a career choice. It was an inescapable trap. It was a role filled by men who were cornered by birthright or by the hangman's noose. They were the ultimate outsiders, performing society's most reviled duties while being denied its compassion. The true horror of the medieval torturer is not the image of a cackling monster, but the far grimmer reality of an ordinary man, forced into a monstrous profession when every other door in the world had been slammed shut in his face. Every job has its environment, a physical space that defines the daily grind. For most of us, that means an office, a workshop, or a storefront. We might complain about the flickering fluorescent lights, the broken coffee machine, or a perpetually chatty coworker. But it's worth taking a moment to appreciate these minor grievances, for we are about to take a tour of a workplace from hell. We're going to explore the medieval torturer's office, the torture chamber. This wasn't just a room for inflicting pain. It was a space where a man had to spend his working hours, day in and day out. Your office had better lighting and less screaming, probably. Let's descend into the darkness and see what a truly terrible commute and an even worse workspace looked like. First, let's consider the location. The classic image is the deep dungeon buried in the bowels of a castle, far from the light of day. This was often true, as subterranean levels provided natural soundproofing and security. But the torturer's office could also be found in other isolated locales. It might be in the upper room of a fortified gatehouse, in a forgotten tower at the edge of the city walls, or in the stone basement of the town hall. The logic was always the same: isolation. The work done here was a state secret and a public shame. The screams had to be muffled, the grisly proceedings hidden from view. The location was deliberately chosen to be a place apart, a pocket of misery surgically removed from the daily life of the city. The daily commute to this workplace was a descent into despair. It began with the selection of a heavy iron key, itself a cold, grim piece of metal. The journey led away from the open air, down narrow, spiraling stone staircases. With each step, the air would grow colder, damper, and heavier. The sounds of the world above, the market, the blacksmith, the church bells, would fade, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The trip concluded at a heavy, iron-banded wooden door, its lock groaning in protest. Pushing it open was the medieval equivalent of clocking in, a deliberate step from the world of the living into a chamber dedicated to suffering and dread. This was the start of the workday. The first thing to assault you upon entering would be the smell. Not one smell, but a thick, complex, and utterly sickening miasma that clung to the air, the walls, and your own clothes. It was a layered bouquet of human misery. The foundational note was the damp, earthy smell of perpetual mildew and wet stone. On top of that lay the sharp, acrid stench of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and raw fear. Woven through it all was the coppery tang of old and new blood, mingling with the gut-wrenching odors of vomit and excrement. This wasn't just an unpleasant smell. It was an oppressive, suffocating presence that you would have to breathe for hours on end. Next, consider the lighting, or the profound lack thereof. There were no wide windows here. The only natural light, if any, might come from a narrow arrow slit high up on the wall, casting a single dusty beam that only served to emphasize the overwhelming darkness. The primary light source was artificial and miserable. A single sputtering torch wedged into an iron sconce was the standard. It coated the walls in a greasy layer of soot and threw wild dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. This gloomy, unreliable light made it difficult to see, turning the chamber into a landscape of terrifying shapes and hidden corners. For the torturer, it meant working in a perpetual, murky twilight. Into this darkness, we must add the soundscape. The stone walls, floor, and ceiling created a natural echo chamber, amplifying every noise into a haunting cacophony. The dominant sound, of course, was human screaming. Not the short, sharp cries of a Hollywood film, but the long, ragged, soul-shattering screams of genuine agony. There were also the sounds of pleading, weeping, and desperate prayer. Beneath this vocal horror was the soundtrack of the job itself. The rhythmic, ominous creak of the wooden rack as it was tightened, the sickening pop of a dislocating joint, the sharp crack of a whip, and the sizzle and hiss of hot iron meeting flesh. It was a symphony of despair, and the torturer was its unwilling conductor. Then there was the feeling of the place, the tactile sensations of the environment. The air was not just cold, it was a damp, penetrating chill that seeped from the stone and settled deep into your bones, a cold that no fire could ever truly banish. Every surface was rough and hostile. The walls were coarse and wet to the touch, slick with moisture and grime. The iron shackles and chains were freezing cold and gritty with rust. The wooden instruments were splintered and stained. To simply exist in this room was to be in constant contact with cold, damp, and abrasive textures, a constant physical reminder of the chamber's grim purpose. One dared not look down for too long, for the floor was a testament to the chamber's filth. It was rarely clean stone, more often it was covered in a thin layer of straw. But this was not the fresh, clean straw of a stable. It was a disgusting, trampled mat, soaked through with dungeon damp, spilled water, bodily fluids, and blood. It was changed infrequently, becoming a breeding ground for mold, insects, and other vermin. Rats, drawn by the smell of filth and blood, were constant unseen companions skittering in the shadows. To walk here was to wade through a shallow layer of accumulated misery, your boots sinking into the grime with every step. Even the air itself seemed to have a taste, stale, thick, and recycled. It was the taste of a sealed room where fear was the main product, the metallic flavor that lodges in the back of your throat when you are terrified or in the presence of blood. The atmosphere was a palpable entity, a psychological weight that pressed down on everyone who entered. For the prisoner, it was a weapon, an environment meticulously crafted to induce hopelessness and break their spirit. For the torturer, it was the air he had to breathe, the atmosphere he had to inhabit. He was marinating in the despair he was tasked to create. The office furniture consisted of the primary instruments of the trade. These were not mythical beasts, but permanent, cumbersome fixtures. In one corner stood the rack, a heavy timber frame that was an ugly, functional piece of engineering. In another might be a large, iron-ringed post for securing prisoners. A stone-lined brazier for heating irons would occupy another space, its embers casting a malevolent red glow. High above, bolted into the ceiling, might be the pulleys and ropes of the Strappado, waiting to hoist a victim towards the unforgiving stone. These were the torturer's workstations, around which his entire miserable day revolved. Supplementing this heavy machinery were the office supplies, the smaller tools of the trade. These would be laid out on a grimy wooden table or hung from hooks on the wall, like a grotesque parody of a craftsman's workshop. Here you would find the thumbscrews, the leg-crushing boots, and the head-squeezing scavenger's daughter. There would be an assortment of pincers, pliers, and knives, all cold iron and businesslike. Whips, scourges, and branding irons completed the collection. For the torturer, these were not objects of horror, but familiar tools, each with a specific function, each a part of the daily, repetitive grind. Of course, this workplace had a complete lack of employee amenities. There was no break room, no water cooler, no comfortable chair. The only water available was likely from a scummy barrel in the corner, its contents brackish and likely used as often for waterboarding as for drinking. Any seating was a hard wooden stool or a cold stone block. There was no respite. No corner of the room that offered even a moment of comfort or peace. The entire space was designed for one purpose only, and the comfort of its operator was not a consideration in its design. It was a space that was as hostile to its keeper as it was to its victims. This environment, a mix of sensory deprivation and overload, had a profound psychological impact. The near-total darkness combined with the echoing screams was disorienting. The sheer monotony of the stone walls, the lack of any view to the outside world, and the constant isolation would induce a powerful sense of claustrophobia and detachment. The The torturer was effectively trapped in a box with another person's agony for hours on end. It was a recipe for psychological damage, forcing a man to either become completely numb to his surroundings or be slowly driven mad by them. And who was responsible for cleaning this chamber of horrors? Not a dedicated custodial staff. This grim duty almost certainly fell to the torturer himself. It was another thankless part of the job. After a session, he would be the one to sluice down the floor with buckets of murky water, to scrape away the filth, and to scatter a fresh layer of straw over the stains that would not wash away. It was a futile, disgusting, and endless task. No matter how much he cleaned, the stench, the stains, and the very memory of the suffering would be permanently ingrained in the stone itself. We must understand that the chamber's features were not accidental, they were part of the torture itself. The environment was weaponized. A prisoner was often left to stew in this space for hours or even days before the interrogation began. The darkness, the cold, the sounds of other victims, the overwhelming stench, it was all a calculated prelude designed to soften them up, to steep them in fear and hopelessness. The torturer, therefore, was not just an operator of machines, he was the manager of a carefully calibrated environment of despair. This meant the chamber was haunted, not by ghosts in the supernatural sense, but by the lingering, palpable memory of every person who had suffered there. The torturer worked in the constant presence of his past work. The dark stains on the floor, the deep grooves worn into the wood of the rack, the echoes that seemed to hang in the air. Every feature of the room was a testament to past agony. He was not working in a sterile environment, he was working in a museum of pain that he himself had curated, a library of screams where every book was a human being he had broken. Finally, at the end of the day, it was time to go home. The torturer would lock the heavy door, the sound of the bolt slamming shut echoing in the sudden silence. He would ascend the stone steps, moving back towards the light and air. But leaving the office was not so simple. The stench of the chamber would cling to his clothes and his skin. The sounds of the day would echo in his ears. The things he had seen and done would be burned into his mind's eye. He could leave the physical space, but he could never truly leave the workplace behind. He carried the horror of that room with him, a constant, invisible filth that further isolated him from the world of the living. Every profession has its tools, instruments honed to perform a specific task with precision and skill. A carpenter has his saws and chisels, a surgeon his scalpels. The medieval torturer, in his own dark and despised way, was also a craftsman. His trade was not creation, but deconstruction. His medium was not wood or stone, but the human body. His workshop was the dungeon, and his tools were objects of ingenious, terrifying design. To understand why his job sucked, we must look closely at these tools, not as mythical props, but as functional equipment that required strength, knowledge, and a stomach-churning intimacy with the mechanics of pain. This was a hands-on job, and as we'll see, operating a rack wasn't just about turning a crank. It was a full-body workout in human misery. In the chilling logic of medieval justice, these instruments were not intended for wanton cruelty. They were tools of interrogation, designed for a single purpose, to extract a confession, the so-called queen of proofs. The application of pain was meant to be a controlled, escalating process, a procedure overseen by judicial clerks who would record the victim's every word. This required the torturer to be more than a mindless brute. He had to be a technician. He had to know his equipment intimately, understanding how to apply just enough force to break a person's will without prematurely ending their life, which would represent a catastrophic failure of the entire legal process. He was the grim engineer of a state-sanctioned system of suffering. Before we examine the genuine articles of this dreadful trade, it is crucial to set aside the phantoms of popular imagination. The most famous torture device of all, the Iron Maiden, is largely a myth. The iconic spiked sarcophagus, most notably the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was not a medieval invention. It was a macabre object fabricated in the late 18th or early 19th century, a ghoulish curiosity created for sensationalist exhibitions long after the era of judicial torture had passed. While there are vague accounts of similar contraptions, the pop culture image of a hinged iron coffin slowly impaling its victim is more fiction than fact. The reality of the torturer's toolkit is less theatrical, but infinitely more brutal and real. Let us begin with the undisputed king of the torture chamber, the rack. Its design was brutally simple and effective. It consisted of a large rectangular wooden frame, often slightly raised off the ground, like a bed. At each end of the frame was a roller, around which ropes were wound. The victim's hands were bound to the ropes at one end and their feet to the ropes at the other. The rollers were connected to a large lever or a heavy ratchet wheel. The torturer's job was to turn this mechanism, tightening the ropes and stretching the victim's body. It was a machine designed to pull a person apart slowly and methodically. Operating the rack was a physically demanding task. It was not the effortless turning of a small crank as often depicted. The mechanism required significant leverage and raw strength to operate against the immense resisting force of a human body's muscles and ligaments. The torturer would have to throw his entire body weight into pushing a large lever, his muscles straining, sweat beading on his forehead. With each turn of the ratchet, the tension would increase, requiring even greater effort. He would feel the victim's resistance transmitted back through the machine, a grotesque physical dialogue, where his exertion was directly converted into the other's agony. For the torturer, this workout was accompanied by a horrific sensory assault. He was positioned right next to the machine, a front-row seat to its devastating effects. He would hear the initial groans of pain from the victim, which would then escalate into ragged screams. He would hear the deep, unsettling groans of the wooden frame under immense strain. Then came the sounds of the body itself yielding. A series of sickening, loud pops and cracks, as cartilage tore, ligaments snapped, and the major joints of the shoulders, hips, elbows, and knees were violently dislocated. He was the direct cause of this human symphony of destruction. If the rack was designed to pull you apart horizontally, the Strappado was designed to tear you apart vertically. Also known as the corda, its mechanics were deceptively simple. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was then thrown over a pulley bolted to the ceiling of the chamber. The torturer, sometimes with an assistant, would then haul on the rope, hoisting the person into the air. The full weight of their body would hang from their arms, which were twisted into a backward, unnatural position. The immediate result was the excruciating dislocation of both shoulders, accompanied by searing, white-hot pain. The torturer's role here was that of a human crane. He had to pull, hand over hand, feeling the full, dead weight of the victim through the rope. He was in complete control of the hoist, able to raise or lower the person with a pull or a release. To increase the agony and the damage, executioners would often attach heavy weights to the victim's ankles, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. This added weight not only intensified the pain, but also significantly increased the physical effort required from the torturer, turning the process into a grueling test of his own strength and endurance. A more extreme variation of the Strappado involved the drop. After hoisting the victim several feet into the air, the torturer would suddenly release the rope, allowing the person to plummet towards the stone floor. Just before impact, he would jerk the rope tight, bringing their fall to a violent, instantaneous halt. The physics of this action were devastating. The massive G-force generated by the sudden stop would not only compound the shoulder dislocations, but could also cause fractures in the wrists, elbows, and collarbones. Orchestrating this required timing and strength, a physically jarring act for the operator, who would feel the brutal shockwave travel back up the rope. Moving from the heavy machinery to the hand tools of the trade, we find devices that required a more intimate form of cruelty. The thumb screw was a classic of this category. It was a simple vise, usually made of iron, with 2 or 3 bars connected by a large screw. The victim's thumbs, fingers, or even toes were placed inside the device. The torturer would then slowly turn the handle, causing the bars to close and crush the digits within. It was a tool of focused, escalating agony capable of producing compliance through relatively minor but unbearable pain. Using the thumbscrew was a personal affair. Unlike the rack, which placed some distance between operator and victim, the thumbscrew required the torturer to be up close. He would likely be kneeling or leaning directly over the prisoner, his face just inches from theirs. He would hold the device steady with one hand while methodically turning the screw with the other, watching their expression, hearing their pleas, and seeing the direct, grisly result of his work, as flesh bruised, skin split, and bones splintered under the immense, localized pressure he was applying. A similar principle was applied to the legs with a device known simply as the boot. There were several variations. Some were iron casings that were heated before being placed on the leg. A more common type was the Spanish boot, a wooden or iron sheath into which the victim's leg was placed. The torturer would then take up a mallet and begin hammering large wooden or iron wedges into the narrow space between the boot and the shin. With each powerful blow, the wedges would drive deeper, pressing with incredible force against the limb. Here, the torturer's exertion was percussive. It was the repetitive, jarring work of swinging a heavy mallet. He would feel the solid impact of each blow travel up his arms. He was the direct agent of the destruction, his hammering first compressing the flesh, then, with a sickening, audible crunch that he would both hear and feel, shattering the tibia and fibula. The process was often repeated on the other leg, requiring dozens of forceful swings, a physically taxing and acoustically horrifying task. A lesser-known but equally vicious device was the scavenger's daughter, a genuine instrument from the Tower of London. It worked on the principle of compression, the opposite of the rack. It was an A-shaped metal contraption that forced the victim into a tightly compressed crouch, forcing their head towards their knees while a bar was tightened across their back. The torturer was responsible for wrestling the prisoner into the device and then methodically tightening the mechanism, locking them into a position of agonizing, body-wide cramping. In extreme cases, the compression was so powerful it could force blood from the nose and ears and dislocate the spine. Using these tools effectively required a dark and profound knowledge. The torturer had to be a physician in reverse, an anatomist of agony. He needed a practical, working understanding of the human body's limits. He had to know precisely how far to turn the rack's wheel to dislocate a shoulder without tearing the arm completely from its socket. He had to know which part of the shin to strike with the wedge for maximum effect. This was not mindless violence, it was a calculated, skilled craft, and the material he worked with was living, screaming flesh. Imagine the daily sensory input of this craftsman. His work was defined by the sounds of splintering bone and tearing cartilage. It was characterized by the sight of mangled limbs and bodies contorted into unnatural shapes. It was steeped in the smells of sweat, blood, and terror, and it was a profoundly tactile job. He felt the resistance of a body on the rack, the weight of a victim on the Strappado's rope, and the crunch of a shin bone through the handle of his mallet. This was not a job one could perform with detachment. It was a full-body immersion in manufactured horror. In the end, the tools were extensions of the torturer's own body. They were inert pieces of wood and iron until he animated them with his own strength and will. The rack did not turn itself. The hammer did not swing on its own. Every ounce of pain inflicted was a direct result of his physical exertion. He was the engine of the machine. This physical connection made his responsibility for the suffering absolute and inescapable. The true weight of these tools was not measured in stone or iron, but in the psychological burden carried by the man forced to wield them. We often imagine history's monstrous jobs as being filled with high drama and twisted passion. We picture the torturer as a villain in a state of constant, frenzied excitement, relishing the unique terror of each new victim. But the grim reality of this profession was far less cinematic. Once you strip away the Hollywood veneer, you find not a story of dynamic evil, but a tale of soul-crushing, bureaucratic repetition. The day-to-day existence of a medieval torturer was above all else a grind. It was a job of profound, horrifying monotony. After all, when your work consists of breaking human beings, you quickly realize it wasn't exactly a new challenges every day kind of work. The popular image of a creative sadist, gleefully devising novel torments for each prisoner, is a romantic fantasy. A real torturer wasn't an evil artist. He was a low-level functionary with a very limited set of tools and an even more limited set of procedures. He didn't have the freedom to improvise. The methods of judicial torture were often strictly prescribed by law and custom. His job wasn't to invent new ways to inflict pain, but to apply the same time-tested, approved methods over and over again. The work was less about macabre creativity and more about the grim, repetitive efficiency of an assembly line. This was because judicial torture was, at its heart, a bureaucratic process. A typical session was not a free-for-all of frenzied violence. It was a formal, structured, and documented event. The chamber would contain not just the torturer and his victim, but also a magistrate or a judicial clerk. This official would sit at a small table with ink, quill, and parchment, ready to record the proceedings. He would read out the formal questions, and the torturer would pause his work to allow the prisoner to answer. The entire process was stop and start, governed by the slow pace of handwritten documentation. The torturer was merely the operator of the machinery, a physical laborer in a legal proceeding. The workday itself was a recurring nightmare. The torturer was essentially on call. A summons would arrive and he would begin the familiar walk to his dreadful office. He would open the same heavy, creaking door, be hit by the same wall of foul air, and see the same grim instruments waiting in the flickering torchlight. The first task was to prepare the chamber and the tools, a routine he could perform in his sleep. Then the prisoner would be brought in, another terrified face that would soon blur into all the others. The cycle was beginning anew, just as it had the day before, and just as it would the day after. The individuals brought before him were not always the hardened criminals or diabolical heretics of legend. More often they were ordinary people caught in the jaws of a merciless system. A farmer accused of witchcraft by a rival neighbor, a woman accused of theft based on hearsay, a man whose religious views deviated slightly from the norm. The torturer would hear the accusations, often flimsy and born of petty squabbles or paranoia, and know that his job was to brutalize this person until they confessed to whatever crime they were accused of, whether they had committed it or not. The sheer banality of the accusations would only have highlighted the absurdity of his work. The procedure itself was a script he knew by heart. The first act was often not physical at all. It was the terition, the threat of torture. The torturer would lead the prisoner through the chamber, methodically presenting the instruments of the trade. He would explain in cold, practiced detail what the rack did to the human body, how the Strappado worked, how the boot could shatter a man's leg. He had likely given this same horrifying show and tell hundreds of times, his voice a monotone drone as he described the agonies to come. For him, it was just the first step in a familiar flowchart of pain. If the threat failed, the procedure moved to the next stage, the application of so-called minor tortures. The judicial orders would specify the first tool to be used, very often the thumbscrews. The torturer would fetch the familiar iron vise, kneel before the prisoner, and begin the rote process of tightening the screw. He knew the exact rhythm of it. A turn, a pause for the question, another turn. He knew the feel of the screw biting into flesh and the sound of the small bones beginning to crack. It was a task he had performed so many times that it lost all its shock, becoming just another repetitive motion his hands had memorized. When the thumbscrews failed to produce the required confession, the clerk would make a note and the judge would authorize the escalation. The torturer would then proceed to the next prescribed step. Perhaps it was the Strappado. He would tie the prisoner's hands with the same familiar knot, heave the rope over the same pulley, and begin the same muscle-straining pull. The sequence of events was utterly predictable, the hoisting, the initial screams, the sickening pop of the shoulders dislocating. It wasn't a decision he made, it was simply the next item on a procedural checklist. It's Tuesday. A heresy charge. Time for the hoist. The sounds of the job would have been one of the most maddeningly repetitive elements. While every human voice is unique, the vocabulary of extreme pain is tragically limited. The same screams, the same desperate pleas for mercy, the same frantic prayers to God, the same eventual, broken sobs of submission. After years on the job, these sounds would cease to be distinct expressions of individual suffering and would instead blend into a constant, featureless background noise. The torturer was surrounded by a perpetual soundtrack of agony that was, in its own terrible way, completely predictable. His own body would become a machine, conditioned to the rhythms of cruelty. The physical exertion was immense, but it was also repetitive. The strain in his back and shoulders from working the rack's lever, the calluses on his hands from hauling the Strappado's rope, the jarring impact in his arm from swinging the mallet for the boot. These were the aches and pains of his trade, a physical memory of his work ground into his own muscles and bones. His body learned the choreography of torture until it became second nature, a muscle memory of human misery. Adding to the grind was the stop-and-start nature of the work, dictated by the ever-present scribe. He would apply pressure, only to be told to stop so the clerk could ask a question and laboriously write down the mumbled, pain-choked response. This prevented any sense of flow, turning the work into a frustrating series of interruptions. It was a process that was simultaneously horrific and tedious, a bizarre fusion of extreme violence and mind-numbing clerical work that would have grated on the nerves of anyone forced to participate in it. More than anyone else in the room, the torturer understood the futility of his own work. He was the world's foremost expert in the fact that torture does not produce truth, it produces words. He knew that under enough pain a person would confess to anything, to flying on a broomstick, to consorting with demons, to plotting against the king. He knew the confession he was so laboriously extracting was almost certainly a fabrication, a desperate attempt to make the agony stop. His job was to manufacture lies, making the entire brutal process a cynical and ultimately pointless exercise. The only way to survive such a daily reality is to go numb. Desensitization is a necessary shield for the soul in the face of relentless horror. The torturer, to preserve his own sanity, would have had to erect massive psychological walls. The screams would become noise, the blood would become a simple workplace mess, and the bodies before him would cease to be people and would instead become objects, workpieces to be processed according to a set of instructions. This emotional numbness was not a sign of inherent evil, but a desperate self-preservation mechanism. This necessary numbness, however, comes at a terrible price, the corrosion of empathy. How can a man spend his days causing unimaginable suffering and then return to his family and community as a whole human being? The mental switch required to do his job, viewing people as mere objects, cannot easily be turned off. This deep functional dehumanization of others would inevitably seep into every aspect of his life, leaving him isolated not just by social stigma, but by the psychological damage of his own profession. And while he might be numb during the day, the night would offer little respite. The conscious mind can build walls, but the subconscious does not forget. The repetitive, traumatic acts of the day would surely replay themselves in his dreams, unedited and raw. The faces, the sounds, the feeling of bone giving way under pressure. These things would become permanent residents of his mind. The monotony of the job wouldn't make it less traumatic. It would grind the trauma deeper and deeper into his psyche with every single repetition. Imagine the sheer, crushing pointlessness of it all. You wake up, go to a place everyone despises, perform a series of physically exhausting and horrific acts on people who are often innocent in order to extract information you know is false. You do this for a meager wage, and in return you are reviled by the very society you are supposedly serving. The daily grind of the medieval torturer wasn't just brutal, it was profoundly and existentially absurd. A perfect recipe for despair. In the end, the torturer was a human machine, a cog in a larger apparatus of justice that ran on pain and fear. His role required not creativity or passion, but the relentless, unthinking repetition of a piston in an engine. The true, deep horror of his job was not found in a single spectacular act of cruelty, but in the endless, soul-destroying monotony of it all. It was the nightmare of being trapped in a loop, where every day was the same and the only product of your labor was agony. When we look at the gruesome tools and brutal methods of medieval torture, a fundamental question arises. Why? Was it all just senseless, sadistic violence? A way for the powerful to terrorize the weak? While it certainly achieved that, the grim reality is that judicial torture operated on a twisted but formal legal logic. It wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about fulfilling a procedural requirement. The entire system was geared towards one specific goal, extracting a confession. The job of the torturer was to get those words by any means necessary, because in the eyes of the law, the truth wasn't something to be discovered, but something to be produced. Turns out, if you torment someone enough, they'll confess to anything. Shocking. The entire system was built upon a legal doctrine known as Regina Probationum, or the Queen of Proofs. Under many medieval legal codes, influenced by a revival of Roman law, a full conviction for a serious crime required an exceptionally high standard of evidence. The court needed either 2 eyewitnesses to the crime itself, a rarity, or a complete confession from the accused. Without one of these 2 things, a judge could not lawfully sentence a suspect, no matter how strong the circumstantial evidence was. This created a legal system that was, in a way, paralyzed by its own high standards, and it craved confessions above all else. This hunger for confessions created a significant problem for the authorities. What if the suspect, guilty or not, simply refused to speak? Their silence could grind the wheels of justice to a complete halt. A notorious murderer or a dangerous heretic could walk free simply by keeping their mouths shut. From the perspective of a medieval jurist, this was an intolerable loophole. Torture, therefore, was seen as the grim but necessary key to unlock a confession from a stubborn suspect. It was a tool not of rage but of legal necessity, designed to force open a door that silence had bolted shut. The body was a treasure chest of truth, and pain was the only way to get it open. This system, horrifying as it was, ironically grew out of what was considered legal progress. It began to replace the older and arguably more arbitrary system of trial by ordeal. In an ordeal, a suspect might be forced to carry a hot iron or be thrown into a body of water. If their hand healed quickly, or if they sank, and likely drowned, God was believed to have proclaimed their innocence. The shift toward a system based on witnesses and confessions was seen as a move toward rationality and evidence. Torture was the bridge between these 2 worlds, a deeply flawed and brutal mechanism that tried to force a rational outcome through irrational means. To give this brutal process a veneer of legality, a complex set of rules and supposed safeguards was established. Chief among these was the requirement of a half-proof, or semi-plena probatio, before torture could even be considered. This meant the authorities needed at least 1 eyewitness or a collection of very strong circumstantial evidence pointing to the suspect's guilt. In theory, this prevented the state from simply rounding people up and torturing them at random. It meant that by the time a person was strapped to the rack, the court had already decided they were probably guilty. This framework positioned the torturer as a mere instrument of the court. He was not, in theory, acting on his own initiative. He could only begin his work after receiving a formal order from a magistrate. During the session, the judge or a clerk would be present, dictating the proceedings. They would determine which instruments to use, how far to escalate the pain, and what questions to ask. This bureaucratic structure was designed to diffuse responsibility. The judge wasn't dirtying his hands, and the torturer was just following orders. He was the muscle, the physical extension of the court's will, a laborer in the grim business of justice. The fundamental catastrophic flaw in this entire system was its central premise, the belief that pain could reliably separate truth from falsehood. The underlying logic was that an innocent person, bolstered by their clear conscience and perhaps the grace of God, would be able to withstand the agony. A guilty person, on the other hand, lacking this divine support, would inevitably break and confess their crimes. This was a catastrophic misunderstanding of human psychology and physiology. The ability to withstand torture has nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with an individual's physical and mental endurance. In reality, the process was perfectly designed to produce falsehoods. A person subjected to unbearable pain does not search their memory for the truth. They search for an escape. Their entire consciousness narrows to a single overwhelming desire to make the pain stop. The leading questions from the interrogating clerk: did you not meet with the devil in the woods? Did you not put poison in your neighbor's well? Provided the prisoner with the very script they needed to end their suffering. The confession was not an act of recollection, but an act of desperate, agonized creation. For the person in the torturer's grasp, it was a hopeless trap. If they maintained their innocence, the pain would continue, often escalating until they either died or were left permanently maimed. If they confessed, they would almost certainly be condemned to death based on that confession. The torturer was the gatekeeper to this impossible choice. He stood at the juncture between agony and condemnation, and his job was to ensure that no one could remain there for long. He was a daily witness to a system that offered no good outcomes, only different paths to destruction. To patch over the obvious ethical holes in this system, the law included one of its most transparently cynical rules. A confession extracted under torture was not, by itself, legally valid. For the confession to be entered into the record, the prisoner had to freely and voluntarily repeat it at a later time, usually a day or two later, outside the torture chamber and without any physical coercion. This was the system's great dishonest alibi, a legal fiction designed to launder a coerced statement into an acceptable piece of evidence. Of course, this second confession was anything but free. The prisoner, now broken in body and spirit, was fully aware of what awaited them if they recanted. The memory of the rack or the Strappado was fresh in their minds. The torturer himself might not have been in the room, but his shadow loomed large. The threat of being sent back to that chamber was an invisible but absolute form of coercion. The authorities could therefore claim the confession was voluntary, all while knowing it was produced by the lingering terror of the torturer's work. This placed the torturer in a unique and morally corrosive position. The judge could believe in the system's fictions, the clerk could focus on his paperwork, but the torturer knew with an expert's certainty that the confession was a lie. He was the one who had physically manufactured it. He had heard the initial denials, he had applied the pressure that broke the victim's will, and he had heard them finally agree to say whatever was required. He was a craftsman whose only product was falsehood, the master of a process designed to disguise agony as truth. If you were to write a job description for a medieval torturer, the primary duty would not be discover the truth, it would be break the human will. His expertise was in understanding the precise mechanics of human suffering. He knew the body's breaking points, the vulnerabilities of the mind, and the overwhelming power of fear. His daily work was a systematic process of dismantling a person's resolve, of pushing them beyond the limits of endurance until their own identity dissolved into a single, desperate need for the pain to end. In this role, he would have inevitably been forced to brutalize people he knew or strongly suspected were innocent. He was a connoisseur of confessions, and he would have been able to tell the difference between the defiant silence of a hardened criminal and the terrified, confused denials of a peasant accused of witchcraft by a jealous neighbor. But the law, and his job, demanded that he treat them all the same. He had to apply the same cold, methodical cruelty, regardless of his own assessment of their guilt. His personal judgment was irrelevant. He was a tool, and a tool does not question its use. To perform this work day after day would require the cultivation of a profound and soul-eating cynicism. Any belief in concepts like justice, truth, or the sanctity of the law would be relentlessly eroded by the daily reality of his job. He was the living engine of the system's greatest lie. He saw the law not as a noble protector of the innocent, but as a machine that fed on pain and produced falsehoods. To believe in the goodness of the system he served would be a form of madness. Cynicism was his only rational perspective. This daily participation in a system of institutionalized cruelty would inflict a deep moral injury. Even if he rationalized his actions as just following orders, the act of methodically and intimately destroying another human being leaves an indelible stain on the soul. He was not a soldier killing an enemy from a distance. He was face to face with his victims, hearing their screams, feeling their bodies break under his hands. This was a trauma that could not be washed away, a moral sickness for which there was no cure. Ultimately, the torturer's so-called quest for truth was a charade, a journey designed to fail. He was the chief navigator on an expedition that was guaranteed to find only what it had planted in the first place. Confessions born of unbearable agony. His job sucked not just because it was physically demanding, socially reviled, and psychologically damaging, but because it was fundamentally dishonest. It was a pointless and morally bankrupt performance, and he was the star player, forced to act out his gruesome part day after day. Of all the miseries that define the life of a medieval torturer, there is one we often overlook, an element more pervasive than the darkness and more constant than the screams. It was the stench, the inescapable, soul-seeping, and profoundly personal horror of the smell. We can scarcely imagine the olfactory landscape of a medieval city, a world of open sewers, animal waste, and unwashed bodies. Now imagine a place that was the epicenter of all that, concentrated and amplified by pain and terror. This was the torturer's office. His work wasn't just brutal, it was foul. Forget a bad day at the office. This was a bad day that followed you home, permanently. Before a single prisoner even entered the chamber, the workplace itself was already steeped in a baseline of foul odors. The very air was a thick, stagnant cocktail of decay. It was the deep, earthy smell of damp stone that never saw the sun, a scent of perpetual mildew and rot that clung to the back of the throat. It was the sour, musty smell of old, decaying straw spread across the floor, and the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron chains and instruments hanging on the walls. This was the foundational miasma, the canvas upon which the true olfactory horrors of the job would be painted each day. It was the smell of a room that was already dead. This baseline was then layered with the unmistakable stench of filth. Sanitation was not a priority in a dungeon. The floor was a repository of every substance imaginable. It was a place of vermin, and it smelled like it. The musky, greasy scent of rats, who were constant, unseen co-workers, mingled with the general odor of decay. The chamber was a sealed container of grime, a place where spills were never truly cleaned, where every form of human and environmental waste was left to fester and compound in the cold, still air. This was the permanent, unchanging perfume of the torturer's professional life. The workday truly began with the arrival of the prisoner, who brought with them the smell of fear. This is not a poetic metaphor, it is a biochemical reality. The sweat produced during intense fear is chemically different from the sweat of simple exertion. It is sharper, more acrid, laced with pheromones that signal terror. For the torturer, this would have been the first human scent to cut through the chamber's miasma. It was the smell of adrenaline and dread, a metallic tang that was as clear a signal as a scream. It was the smell of a new subject, a new project for the day. As the grim work commenced, that initial scent of fear would be quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sweat produced by agony. This wasn't the smell of a laborer in a field. It was the pungent, overpowering stench of a body in revolt. Pores open, releasing a flood of salty, acrid perspiration that would soak the prisoner's clothes and run in rivulets onto the floor. The air would become thick and humid with the steam of this terror-induced sweat, a close, cloying smell that the torturer would be breathing in from mere feet away, a constant reminder of the extreme physical stress he was inflicting. Under the unbearable strain of torture, the body's most basic functions betray it. The bladder would release, adding the sharp, stinging smell of ammonia to the foul air. The pungent stench of fresh urine would cut through the other odors, a primal smell of submission and the loss of all control. It would soak into the straw, into the prisoner's clothes, and into the wooden frames of the instruments themselves. For the torturer, this was not a rare or shocking event. It was a routine part of the job, another layer of filth he had to work in and breathe in, day after miserable day. Following urine, inevitably, came the even more potent and viscerally unsettling smell of feces. As the body was pushed past its limits, the bowels would also give way. This deep, raw, and fundamentally human smell of excrement would fill the small, enclosed space with an almost unbearable intensity. It is a smell associated with profound humiliation, sickness, and the complete breakdown of human dignity. The torturer had to become numb to this, to treat it as just another consequence of his work, another mess to be dealt with later. He had to breathe in the scent of total human degradation and call it a Tuesday. The body's revolt continued. The sheer shock to the system, the dizzying pain or the overwhelming terror would often cause the prisoner to vomit. The sour, acidic stench of bile and partially digested food would be added to the horrifying olfactory chorus. The torturer would have to stand there, amidst the screams and the filth, as his subject retched uncontrollably, adding yet another layer of sickness to the environment. The chamber was not just a place of pain, but a small contained ecosystem of human effluence, and he was its permanent resident. And then there was blood. It had a smell all its own, a smell that would be a constant presence in the torturer's life. He would know its nuances intimately. There was the fresh, almost metallic smell of newly spilled blood from a lashing or the application of pincers. But there was also the sickly, sweet, decaying smell of old blood. a scent that would be permanently ingrained in the wooden tools, the stone floor, and the very walls of the chamber. He would see the old stains, and his nose would remind him of what they were, a library of past agonies catalogued by scent. For those sessions that involved fire, an entirely new and uniquely horrific smell was introduced. The use of a heated branding iron or hot coals would produce the nauseating, greasy stench of burning hair and cooking human flesh. It is a smell that defies adequate description, a grotesque fusion of a barbecue and a funeral pyre. This scent, pungent and invasive, would sear itself into the torturer's nasal passages and memory, a smell of such profound horror that it would be impossible to ever forget. It was the smell of a human being turned into meat. These individual smells did not exist in isolation. They blended, they mixed, they compounded on each other in the stagnant air. The sweet decay of old blood, the sharp tang of fresh urine, the sourness of vomit, the salt of sweat, and the deep foulness of feces. All of these combined to create a single, unique, and overpowering miasma. This was the true perfume of the profession. The signature scent of the chamber was a smell so thick you could almost taste it, a tangible presence that defined the very nature of the torturer's world. Even the act of cleaning, if it ever happened, provided no relief. There were no chemical disinfectants, no industrial cleaners. Cleaning meant sluicing the stone floor with a bucket of likely brackish water. This would do little more than stir up the filth, creating a foul-smelling slurry of wet straw, mud, blood, and human waste. The act of cleaning would temporarily make the stench even worse, a churning, mobile version of the chamber's static horror. The concept of a clean workspace was an unimaginable luxury. This miasma was not a hazard that could be left at the office door at the end of the day. The torturer's clothes, likely made of thick, coarse wool or leather, were perfect sponges for these odors. Every foul scent of the chamber would be absorbed into the very fibers of his tunic and leggings. When he walked out of the dungeon, he did not leave the stench behind. He wore it like a second skin, an invisible but powerful uniform that announced his profession to the world. The smell would not just be on his clothes, it would be on his person. It would be ground into the skin of his hands, trapped under his fingernails, and infused in his hair and beard. He would have had constant, direct physical contact with blood, sweat, and filth. The simple act of washing with cold water and harsh lye-based soap would do little to remove such a deep-seated, compound stench. He could scrub his hands raw, but he could never truly wash away the smell of his work. He was permanently scented with suffering. This personal, portable stench had devastating social consequences. It was the ultimate mark of the outcast. People would literally smell him coming. In the market, others would shrink away, their noses wrinkling in disgust. He would be denied entry to taverns not just because of his dishonorable profession, but because his very presence was an olfactory assault. The smell was a physical manifestation of his social stigma, creating an invisible 6-foot barrier of revulsion around him at all times. Imagine bringing that smell home. Imagine the impact on his family, on his wife and children. His isolated house, the one place he might have sought refuge from the world's contempt, would also be contaminated. The foul scent would cling to the furniture, the bedding, his own children. There could be no truly clean space in his life. The misery of his profession would follow him into his most intimate moments, poisoning his home life and marking his family with the same olfactory stain of his trade. In the end, the constant, inescapable stench was perhaps the most insidious aspect of why it sucked to be a medieval torturer. It was more than just an unpleasant sensation, it was a brand. It was a permanent, suffocating reminder of every scream, every broken body, and every moment of degradation he had ever witnessed or caused. It was the unwashable ghost of his victims, clinging to his skin, his clothes, and his soul, ensuring that he could never, ever truly clock out. In the rigid social hierarchy of the medieval world, every person had their place. The noble fought, the priest prayed, and the peasant toiled. But what about the torturer? He was an official employee of the state or the church, a salaried, vital cog in the machinery of justice. By all accounts, he should have held a position of some authority, or at least grudging respect. Yet the reality was the polar opposite. He was a pariah, a social leper, a necessary evil that everyone needed but nobody wanted. He was feared, hated, and utterly, profoundly alone. As you can imagine, nobody invited the torturer to the medieval potluck, for obvious reasons. This profound ostracism was rooted in the concept of honorable and dishonorable professions. In many parts of Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, society classified certain jobs as honoricles Leute, the dishonorable people. This category was reserved for those whose work brought them into contact with the unclean, death, disease, crime, and waste. It included gravediggers, latrine cleaners, knackers who disposed of animal carcasses, and, at the very bottom of this already despised group, the executioner and his counterpart, the torturer. This wasn't just a bad reputation, it was a formal, soul-crushing social classification. The primary emotion the torturer inspired was a deep, primal fear. This wasn't just the logical fear that you might one day end up in his chamber. It was a more superstitious, almost magical dread. People believed that the torturer was spiritually contaminated by his constant proximity to sin, pain, and death. His touch was thought to bring bad luck, sickness, or spiritual pollution. He was seen as a harbinger of doom, a man whose very shadow could cast a blight upon your day. This deep-seated fear meant that people didn't just dislike him, they were actively terrified of any form of contact. This social rejection was written into the very geography of the town. The torturer was legally and socially forbidden from living among the honorable citizens. He was relegated to the literal fringes of society, his home often situated on the worst possible plot of land. He would live outside the city walls, or in a squalid corner of town next to the gallows he operated, the town dump, the brothels, or the leper colony. His physical address was a constant public declaration of his status. He was human refuse, pushed to the margins alongside everything else the town deemed unclean and undesirable. To ensure he could never escape his identity, the torturer was sometimes forced to wear specific clothing that marked him as dishonorable. This could be a particular color, such as a garish yellow, or a garment with a symbol sewn onto it, like a depiction of a gallows or a wheel. This prevented any possibility of anonymity. He couldn't blend into a crowd or enjoy a moment of being just another fate. He was a walking, talking symbol of his dreadful profession, a public bogeyman whose identity was announced to everyone he passed on the street. Even the most basic economic interactions were fraught with humiliation. How does a man whose touch is considered toxic buy a loaf of bread? A shopkeeper might serve him last, after every other customer had gone. They might refuse to take coins directly from his hand, forcing him to place them on the counter to be collected later. Some accounts describe merchants using a long stick to pass goods to him, maintaining as much distance as possible. Every single day, the simple act of trying to feed his family was a fresh reminder that he was considered less than human. The heart of medieval social life was the tavern, a place for news, stories, and companionship. This world was completely closed to the torturer. He could not walk in and order an ale alongside the local blacksmiths and farmers. He would be met with a wall of hostile silence, or he would be outright refused service and told to leave. The tavern was a community living room, and he was the one person who was permanently uninvited. There was no casual friendship, no shared laughter, no sense of belonging to be found for a man in his line of work. This profound exclusion extended even to the house of God. While the church employed his services in cases of heresy, it simultaneously held him at arm's length. Torturers and executioners were often barred from receiving communion, the central rite of the Christian faith. If they were allowed inside the church at all, they were forced to stand in a designated sinner's corner, far from the main congregation, publicly shamed before God and man. He was tasked with defending the faith through his work, yet he was treated as though his soul was already damned beyond saving. The result of all this was a life of crushing loneliness. Who would, or could, befriend the torturer? Any honorable person who associated with him risked becoming tainted by the same stigma. To be seen sharing a conversation with the torturer was social suicide. His only potential companions were others from the dishonorable trades, but even they might have shunned him as being at the very bottom of their despised hierarchy. His life was a prison of solitude, built by the fear and hatred of the very community he served. Ironically, this total ostracism came with a few strange and grim perks. Because he lived outside the normal rules of society, he was often exempt from paying taxes, tolls, or civic duties. In some regions, he had the right of havage, allowing him to take a small portion of produce from market stalls for free. This was not a privilege born of respect, but a practical concession. It was easier to just let him take a handful of vegetables than to engage in the awkward, contaminating ritual of a cash transaction. It was a benefit born of pure disgust. One of the strangest paradoxes of his existence was his secret life as a folk healer. While the educated physicians of the town studied texts, the executioner had a unique hands-on knowledge of human anatomy gained from his gruesome work. He knew how bones broke and how muscles tore. Consequently, the very same people who would cross the street to avoid him during the day might sneak to his isolated house at night, seeking treatment for a dislocated shoulder, a broken bone, or a persistent ailment. He was a feared monster by day and a respected healer by night, a bizarre duality that highlights the hypocrisy of the society that shunned him. The most tragic aspect of this social stigma was that it was hereditary. The torturer did not suffer alone. His entire family was engulfed by his dishonor. His wife, by marrying him, took on his outcast status. His children were born into it, branded from birth with their father's professional shame. They were seen as children of the devil, tainted by a sin they had not committed. The curse of his job was a legacy he was forced to pass on to the people he loved. Imagine the childhood of the torturer's son. He would be mercilessly bullied, the target of cruel rhymes and vicious taunts. He would be barred from attending any kind of school. No master craftsman would ever accept him as an apprentice. His future was sealed from the moment he was born. He would almost certainly follow his father into the same miserable profession, as it was the only trade open to him. His life path was a circle, a closed loop of inherited shame and brutality. This led to the problem of finding a spouse. The torturer's son could not hope to marry the daughter of a respectable merchant or farmer. His family name was poison. Consequently, they were forced to marry within their own despised caste. The son of an executioner would marry the daughter of a knacker or a gravedigger from another town. These arranged marriages created entire dynasties of the dishonorable, families intertwined by their shared social damnation, further cementing their isolation from the rest of the world. For the children of the torturer, escape was nearly impossible. The stain of the family's profession was indelible. Even if a son were to run away to a distant city and change his name, the tight-knit nature of medieval society and the guild systems would likely expose his origins sooner or later. Once his background was discovered, the doors would slam shut and he would find himself an outcast once more. The dishonor of the father was a debt the son would be forced to pay for his entire life. The ultimate bitter irony of the torturer's existence was his position as an outsider on the inside. He was an agent of the law, a tool used to enforce the community's moral and legal standards. He was, in a twisted sense, a guardian of the social order. Yet, he was utterly denied any place within that order. He was tasked with purging sin and crime from the community, but in doing so, he became the most sinful and criminal-like figure in the public imagination. His life was a prison without walls. The dungeon he worked in with its stone, chains, and darkness was only his place of employment. His true prison was the town itself, a place where every face was hostile, every door was closed, and every interaction was a fresh humiliation. The job of a medieval torturer sucked not just because of the screams, the blood, and the filth, but because of the profound, unending, and crushing loneliness that came with being the one person everyone needed and absolutely no one wanted. We have explored the physical filth, the social isolation, and the moral bankruptcy of the medieval torturer's profession, but now we must descend into the deepest, darkest dungeon of all, the one inside his own skull. What happens to the human mind when its daily function is the systematic and intimate destruction of other human beings? What is the long-term psychological price for a career spent in the company of agony? This is a question that modern psychology is still grappling with in the context of soldiers and other practitioners of violence. For the medieval torturer, there were no studies, no support groups, and certainly no counselors. Even monsters probably had a terrible therapist, if they had therapists at all. Faced with a daily reality of unimaginable horror, the human mind must adapt to survive. For the torturer, it seems there were two primary paths his psyche could take, two desperate strategies to keep from shattering completely. The first was the path of numbness, of building a callus so thick over the soul that nothing could penetrate it. The second was the path of madness, where the mind, unable to build those walls, simply breaks under the unbearable strain. Desensitization or destruction. These were the grim options on a career path that offered no hope of a healthy outcome. We must, however, view these paths through the lens of the medieval worldview. They didn't have the language of post-traumatic stress disorder or moral injury. Their internal struggles were framed by the powerful concepts of sin, duty, divine judgment, and eternal damnation. A torturer wrestling with his conscience wasn't having a mental health crisis. He was engaged in a battle for his immortal soul. His nightmares weren't just symptoms of trauma, they were potential visions of the hell that awaited him. His guilt was not just a psychological burden, it was a spiritual poison. The most common and, in a functional sense, most necessary adaptation was to become numb. Desensitization is a powerful survival mechanism. The mind, to protect itself from the trauma of repeated exposure to horror, simply learns to stop reacting. The first time, the sound of a bone breaking is sickening. The 100th time, it is merely a sound. The first time, the sight of blood is shocking. The 1000th time, it is just a mess that needs to be cleaned up. This emotional anesthesia was the torturer's only real shield against the daily onslaught of his work. This numbness was achieved through the deliberate, constant practice of dehumanization. To do his job, the torturer could not see the person before him as a fellow human being with a family, hopes, and fears. He had to mentally reclassify them. They became the subject, the accused, a case file, or simply an object to which a procedure must be applied. This cognitive trick created the emotional distance required to turn the crank, pull the rope, or swing the mallet. He wasn't hurting a person, he was merely processing a thing. This was the lie he had to tell himself every single day. To bolster this fragile mental wall, the torturer would have clung desperately to the concept of cognitive dissidence. How does one reconcile the fact, I am a man, with the action, I am inflicting agony upon another? By latching onto a third, overriding idea, I am just doing my duty. This mantra became a vital shield for his psyche. He wasn't a monster, he was an instrument of the law. He was a servant of the state, a tool of justice. By convincing himself that he had no personal agency in the matter, that he was merely following orders, he could displace the crushing weight of his actions onto the abstract authority of the system he served. We see a potential real-world example of this successful compartmentalization in the detailed diary of Meister Franz Schmidt, a 16th-century German executioner. His writings reveal a man who is deeply pious, a good family man, and someone intensely concerned with his own honor. He walled off his gruesome work from his personal identity, viewing it as a grim but necessary service to his community. He saw himself as a craftsman performing a difficult job, not a monster. This ability to separate the deed from the self was the key to his long and functional career. But this protective numbness came at an appalling price: the death of empathy. The same emotional calluses that shielded him from the suffering of his victims also blocked his ability to experience positive human emotions. How could he connect with the simple joy of his own child, or the love of his wife, when his emotional palette had been bleached of all its color? He would become a ghost in his own home, a hollowed-out man, present in body but absent in spirit, his capacity for tenderness and connection eroded by his daily work. This path of numbness also leads inevitably to a deep and corrosive cynicism. The torturer, more than anyone, knew the justice he served was a lie. He knew the confessions he extracted were products of pain, not truth. This daily participation in a dishonest system would obliterate any faith he might have had in the law, in his superiors, and perhaps in human nature itself. The world, from his perspective, would seem a place governed not by truth and morality, but by power and violence. This cynical worldview would only deepen his isolation. So the successful torturer, the one who didn't go mad, was the one who managed to kill his own soul. He became a functional automaton of cruelty. He could perform his duties with cold efficiency, he could withstand the sights and sounds of his trade, and he could sleep at night. But this peace was purchased at the cost of his own humanity. He hadn't lost his mind, but he had lost what made him a man. He was a walking ghost, a machine made of flesh and bone, forever detached from the world around him. But what happened when this coping mechanism failed? What if a man's mind was not capable of building such impenetrable walls? This is where the path of numbness ends and the path of madness begins. For some, the trauma was simply too immense, the acts too horrific to be walled off. The horror would leak through the cracks, poisoning everything. For these men, the job was not a numbing routine, but a slow, agonizing descent in. The first sign of the mind-breaking would be the invasion of nightmares. The daytime was for inflicting suffering. The nighttime was for reliving it. The screams he learned to ignore while awake would become deafening in his sleep. He would see the faces of his victims, not as objects, but as they truly were. Terrified, broken people. He would be haunted not by supernatural ghosts, but by the far more terrifying ghosts of his own memory, replaying his worst deeds on a nightly loop from which there was no escape. This internal torment would eventually manifest in his waking life. He might be plagued by fits of uncontrollable rage, lashing out at his family or the few people he interacted with. He might sink into a profound, silent melancholy, what we would now call depression. He might turn to heavy drinking, seeking to drown his memories in alcohol. He might become paranoid, seeing accusers and judges in every shadow. The man who projected terror all day would become, in his own mind, the one who was constantly terrified. In a world so deeply concerned with sin, guilt itself could become a form of madness. A torturer who failed to compartmentalize might come to see himself as a creature of pure evil, his soul irrevocably damned. He would feel the fires of hell licking at his feet long before he died. This overwhelming conviction of his own damnation could lead to severe self-destructive behaviors, a desire for punishment, or a complete psychotic break from reality. He wasn't just doing a bad job, he was actively paving his own road to eternal suffering. There is also a darker, more terrifying possibility. For a mind that was already unstable or predisposed to cruelty, the constant exposure to violence could act as a catalyst. The initial reluctance or horror could curdle into a perverse enjoyment. The need to dehumanize his victims could transform into a genuine belief in their subhumanity. This is how a man, forced into the role of a monster, might eventually choose to become one, finding a twisted sense of power and release in the very acts that were destroying him. In the end, neither path led anywhere good. It was an unwinnable war for the soul. The torturer was presented with an impossible psychological ultimatum. You can lose your mind or you can lose your humanity. Become a raving, guilt-ridden lunatic or become a cold, unfeeling automaton. Either way, the person you were before you first picked up the tools of the trade was gone forever, a casualty of the job. The most inescapable dungeon the torturer inhabited, then, was the one between his own ears. He could leave the stone chamber, wash the blood from his hands, and walk away from the rack, but he could never escape his own mind. The memories, the sounds, the smells, and the crushing weight of his deeds were his permanent cellmates. His true life sentence was not to work in a prison, but to have the prison work its way inside of him. In our exploration of why it sucked to be a medieval torturer, we've painted a picture of a man who was psychologically tormented, socially despised, and professionally miserable. But through all of this, we might still imagine him as being physically safe, a figure of untouchable power in his dark domain. This, however, was another grim illusion. The same job that made him feared also made him a target. He was a man surrounded by enemies, a symbol of everything people hated, and his personal safety was as fragile as the bones of his victims. His work wasn't just a grind, it was a genuine occupational hazard, a daily dance with the threat of violent retribution. The greatest danger he faced came from his role as the public face of oppression. To the common person, the lord in his castle or the bishop in his palace was a distant, abstract source of power. Their decrees might be the cause of suffering, but they were largely unreachable. The torturer, however, was the hands-on agent of that suffering. He was the man who turned the screw, the man who wielded the whip. When the people's anger and resentment boiled over, he was the most visible, accessible, and hated symbol of the entire brutal system. He was a lightning rod for popular fury. History is rife with periods of intense social unrest, peasant revolts, urban riots, and religious uprisings, often triggered by famine, plague, or crippling taxes. When the oppressed finally snapped, their rage was seldom directed at the king but at the local instruments of their oppression. They attacked tax collectors, they burned court records, and they went hunting for figures like the torturer. He was the embodiment of their pain, and in a revolt, symbols make for very appealing targets. The Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England, these were moments when the social order was turned upside down, and the torturer was on the wrong side of that inversion. Imagine the scene. A mob, armed not with swords and shields, but with pitchforks, scythes, and a burning sense of injustice. They aren't storming the heavily defended castle keep. They are heading for the isolated, undefended house on the edge of town where the torturer lives. He, a man accustomed to having absolute power over a single, restrained individual, would now face the collective, unrestrained fury of an entire community. His professional skills would be useless against a wave of people who saw him as the devil incarnate. For the angry mob, he was the one man whose suffering they could all agree upon. The fate of a torturer or executioner caught by such a mob was predictably brutal. There would be no formal charges, no trial, and certainly no mercy. He would be dragged from his home and subjected to a swift and bloody form of popular justice. Often the crowd would, with a deep and satisfying sense of irony, inflict upon him the very torments he was famous for. Using his own tools against him, his death would be a cathartic, public spectacle, a moment of savage release for a populace that had, until that moment, been forced to live in fear of him. Even if he survived large-scale rebellions, a more personal and persistent threat lingered in the shadows, the threat of private revenge. Every person he maimed or helped send to the gallows had a family. They had sons, daughters, brothers, or wives who were left with nothing but grief and a burning desire for vengeance. In a society where family honor was paramount and blood feuds were not uncommon, the duty to avenge a wronged relative was a powerful motivator. The torturer didn't just create victims, he created generations of potential enemies. The very nature of his work made him a prime target for a vendetta. His face was often the last thing a condemned person saw, and his name was inextricably linked to their suffering. That name and face would be passed down through the victim's family, a whispered promise of retribution. A son who watched his father hang or whose mother was broken on the rack would grow up with one single, driving purpose: to one day find the man responsible and repay him in kind. The torturer's past work was a long list of grievances just waiting to be answered. with a knife in the dark. This threat would have fostered a state of constant, low-level paranoia. The torturer could never truly relax. Every unfamiliar face in the market, every person who stared a second too long, every footstep behind him on a dark lane could be the avenger he knew was coming for him one day. He lived his life looking over his shoulder, forever wondering which of his many past victims would be the cause of his own violent end. The fear he instilled in others was reflected back at him as a life sentence of perpetual anxiety. His profound social isolation made him uniquely vulnerable to this kind of attack. He had no friends to watch his back. His neighbors, who already despised him, would not intervene if he were assaulted. They would likely just shut their doors and windows and pretend not to hear his screams. If an avenger came for him, he would be utterly on his own. The same social stigma that made his life miserable also stripped him of any form of collective security, leaving him an easy, solitary target. Consider, too, the danger posed by those who survived his work. Not everyone who entered the chamber was condemned. Some were released due to a lack of evidence, a change in the political climate, or because they managed to endure the torment without confessing. These individuals were now walking free, carrying the memory of what he had done to them in their minds, and the scars of his work on their bodies. They knew his face, his voice, and his methods. Each survivor was a walking, talking, and highly motivated threat who could seek their own revenge or incite others to do so. Now let's move the danger from the street into the office itself. The torture chamber was an inherently hazardous workplace. It was a small, enclosed space, often with only one exit. And in that space, the torturer was frequently alone with a desperate and terrified individual, with perhaps only a single non-combatant clerk for company. While the prisoner was usually restrained, the process of securing them was a moment of high risk. A moment of carelessness, a poorly tied knot, or an underestimation of the prisoner's strength could be a fatal mistake. A person facing the prospect of unbearable agony or certain death has absolutely nothing left to lose. For them, a desperate act of violence might seem like their only option. A sudden lunge during a moment of inattention, an attempt to use their own chains as a garrote, or a headbutt aimed at the torturer's face. These were all risks inherent in the job. The torturer had to be constantly vigilant, a prison guard and a brawler as much as a technician of pain, because his workpiece could at any moment decide to fight back with the fury of a cornered animal. The chamber itself was filled with potential weapons. The very tools of the torturer's trade could be turned against him. A desperate prisoner managing to free a hand could grab a nearby set of pincers, a knife, or a heavy iron implement from the workbench. A poker left in the brazier became a deadly spear. In the chaos of a struggle, the torturer could be the one to end up on the receiving end of his own equipment. As we said, sometimes the tools were used against the wielder. Plot twist. Finally, the danger was not just confined to the dungeon. For public punishments or executions, the torturer had to perform his duties before a crowd, and crowds are fickle and dangerous. A botched execution, a missed swing of the axe, a hangman's knot that failed to work cleanly, could turn the mood of the spectators from morbid curiosity to violent rage in an instant. The mob, feeling the condemned was being subjected to needless cruelty, could surge forward, and their anger would be directed at the one person responsible, the seemingly incompetent executioner. The state that employed the torturer offered him a wage and a mandate, but it provided little in the way of a security detail or a pension plan. He was a disposable asset. If a mob tore him limb from limb, or an avenger's knife found his ribs, the authorities would simply find a replacement, likely by offering another condemned criminal the same terrible job. He had no union, no backup, and no safety net. He was utterly, terrifyingly expendable. So while the torturer's job was to be the fearsome one, his own life was saturated in fear. He feared the collective rage of the mob that saw him as a symbol. He feared the singular hatred of the avenger stalking him in the shadows. He feared the desperate violence of the prisoner on his table. He lived in a state of constant, justifiable paranoia. His job sucked not only because it was lonely, filthy, and morally corrupt, but because it was a high-risk profession where a messy, violent death was a very real possibility. In the modern world, we worry about job security. We think about automation, corporate downsizing, and the ever-changing market. But it's safe to say that our career anxieties pale in comparison to those of the medieval torturer. His was a profession whose very existence was balanced on a knife's edge, entirely dependent on the shifting winds of law, religion, and politics. He was a highly specialized worker in a field that could become obsolete overnight, leaving him with a monstrous reputation and a completely useless skill set. One day you're inflicting agony as a vital part of the justice system, the next you're looking for a new gig. Tough break. The torturer's profession wasn't some timeless, eternal feature of medieval society. It was, in fact, a product of a very specific historical trend. For much of the early Middle Ages, guilt or innocence was determined by trial by combat, or ordeal. But around the 12th century, European legal systems began to rediscover and re-implement Roman law, which placed a huge emphasis on evidence and, most importantly, on confessions. This legal revolution created the demand for a specialist who could extract those confessions. The torturer's job, therefore, was not an ancient evil, but a new and booming industry created by a shift in legal theory. This meant his employment was directly tied to the intellectual and spiritual zeitgeist of his era. He was a man whose livelihood depended entirely on the ideas currently in fashion among the powerful. If the prevailing legal theory held that a coerced confession was the queen of proofs, then he was in business. But if those theories changed, if new ideas about justice and human rights began to take hold, his entire profession could be rendered instantly irrelevant. He wasn't just a laborer, he was a living embodiment of a particular philosophy, and philosophies can change with alarming speed. No factor influenced the demand for his services more than religious fervor. In times of relative peace and stability, his work might be limited to standard criminal cases. But during periods of intense religious upheaval, such as the various inquisitions targeting heretics or the great witch hunts that swept through Europe, business would boom. Crimes like heresy or witchcraft were spiritual in nature, often lacking any physical evidence. A confession was the only possible proof. In these moments of mass paranoia, the torturer became one of the most sought-after specialists in the land. During these grim boom times, the torturer would have been exceptionally busy. The dungeons would be full, and the magistrates would be demanding confessions on an industrial scale. His days would be a relentless cycle of applying his grim trade to a steady stream of accused heretics and witches. In these moments, surrounded by the tools of his craft and with a long line of clients waiting, he might have felt, in a dark and twisted way, a sense of job security. He was needed. His skills, however reviled, were in high demand, but this demand was always temporary. The political climate was another major variable in his career prospects. His employment was often at the whim of a single individual, the local king, prince, or bishop. If his ruler was paranoid, cruel, or obsessed with rooting out conspiracies, the torturer's services would be constantly required. He would be a key instrument of state power, a tool to crush dissent and solidify his master's authority. His job security was directly proportional to the ruler's insecurity. However, a change in leadership could spell disaster for his career. A new ruler, perhaps more lenient, more compassionate, or simply more interested in other forms of governance, might take power. This new leader might see judicial torture as a barbaric and counterproductive practice. With the stroke of a pen, he could issue a decree limiting or even banning the use of torture in his domain. The torturer, who was a vital state employee one week, could find himself unemployed the next, his position eliminated by a shift in the political winds. Even without a change in rulers, the legal tides themselves were constantly shifting. Jurists and scholars across Europe continuously debated the merits and morality of torture. New legal codes were written and revised. These codes might introduce stricter rules for the application of torture, such as requiring more preliminary evidence, limiting the number of times it could be applied, or banning certain extreme methods. Each new restriction, each new piece of regulatory red tape, chipped away at the torturer's utility, making his job less central to the judicial process. Consider the aftermath of a local witch hunt. For months, the town might be gripped by a fever of accusation and paranoia, with the torturer at the very center of the proceedings. Then, just as suddenly, the panic could subside. The authorities, perhaps growing uneasy with the number of executions or realizing the absurdity of the confessions, would halt the trials. The torturer, who had been working tirelessly, would find his dungeons suddenly empty. The demand for his unique skills would evaporate, leaving him idle in a community that now associated him with a shameful and bloody episode they all wanted to forget. All of this uncertainty translated into a profoundly unstable income. The torturer was rarely a salaried employee in the modern sense. He was often paid on a piecework basis, a set fee for each session of torture, with a possible bonus for extracting a confession. This meant his livelihood was directly tied to the fluctuating demand for his services. A busy month of trials meant he could feed his family. A quiet month could mean financial ruin. This precarity added a layer of constant, mundane anxiety to a life already defined by horror and isolation. The ultimate death knell for the torturer's profession was the great intellectual shift of the 18th century, the Enlightenment. A new generation of thinkers began to champion reason, human rights, and the reform of brutal, arbitrary systems of power. Philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu directed their formidable intellects against the injustices of the old regime, and judicial torture was one of their prime targets. For the first time, a widespread, intellectually coherent argument against the torturer's entire existence began to take hold. The most powerful blow came in 1764 with the publication of a short but revolutionary book by the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria titled On Crimes and Punishments. Beccaria argued with devastating clarity that torture was not just cruel but fundamentally irrational and useless. He pointed out that a weak, innocent person would confess under torment, while a strong, guilty person might withstand it. Therefore, the practice served only to condemn the innocent and acquit the guilty. His book was a bestseller, translated into every major European language, and it became the foundational text for the abolition movement. These new ideas quickly found fertile ground in the minds of Europe's enlightened despots. These were monarchs who wanted to be seen as modern, rational, and humane. Frederick the Great of Prussia, a correspondent of Voltaire, was one of the first to act, abolishing torture in his territories in 1754. With that single royal decree, the job of every torturer in Prussia simply ceased to exist. Their skills were no longer needed, their role no longer sanctioned, they were officially redundant. This was the beginning of a domino effect that swept across the continent. Over the next several decades, one nation after another reformed its legal code and abolished judicial torture. Sweden, Austria, Tuscany, France, and many others followed suit. For the men who practiced the trade, it was a slow-motion professional apocalypse. It was a mass extinction event for their entire career path, driven by the powerful force of a new idea. This left the now unemployed torturer in an impossible position. Imagine trying to find a new line of work. What are his transferable skills? He has an intimate knowledge of human anatomy, but from the perspective of taking it apart. He has immense physical strength, but it's conditioned for a gruesome purpose. He has experience in a results-oriented environment, but the results are screams and broken bodies. His entire professional identity was built on a practice that was now officially condemned as barbaric and shameful. So what could he do? His family name was already a synonym for dishonor. His reputation was that of a monster. He couldn't apprentice himself to an honorable trade like baking or carpentry. No guild would have him. He was left with nothing but his infamy and his collection of horrifying, now useless tools. He was a specialist in a field that had been permanently closed, a man whose life's work had been declared a crime against humanity. The unemployed torturer thus became a living ghost, a relic of a savage past in an age that prided itself on reason and enlightenment. He was a walking, talking reminder of a system everyone now wanted to pretend had never existed. His job sucked not only while he was performing it, but perhaps even more so when it was taken away. It left him utterly adrift, a man whose only skill was the creation of suffering, in a world that had finally decided it had seen enough. For most people, the hope of a legacy, of being remembered for something good and honorable, is a fundamental human desire. A knight dreamed of being immortalized in tales of chivalry. A king hoped for his name to be etched into the grand narrative of his nation. Even a simple craftsman wished for his work, a well-built table or a beautiful piece of pottery to survive him. But for the medieval torturer, there was no such comfort. His legacy was not one of honor but of horror, not of celebration but of condemnation. His reward for a lifetime of grim service was to be remembered only as a monster. As you might have guessed, no heroic ballads were sung about the guy who stretched people on a rack. In the Middle Ages, a person's legacy was forged in the chronicles of monks, the songs of troubadours, and the stone of cathedrals. The historical record was overwhelmingly concerned with the deeds of the great and powerful. It was a narrative of kings and popes, of glorious battles and noble lineages. To have your name recorded in these pages was to achieve a form of immortality. It was a confirmation that your life had mattered, that your actions were worthy of being preserved for posterity. This path to being remembered, however, was a club with a very strict membership policy, and the torturer was permanently blacklisted. In the official documents of the time, the torturer is most often a ghost, a nameless functionary. The records might state that a prisoner was put to the question or subjected to the torment, but the agent of that torment is rarely identified. He is simply the executioner, the hangman, or some other grim title. His individuality, his personhood, was erased by the state he served, subsumed entirely by his horrific function. He was not a man worthy of a name, but a role, a task, a thing that the official record was quietly ashamed of. On the rare occasions when a torturer or executioner was named in a historical document, it was almost never for praise. His name would appear in a court record as a recipient of a fee for his services, a grim accounting entry. Or he might be named in a document condemning a tyrannical ruler, listed as an instrument of that tyrant's cruelty. He was mentioned not as a hero, but as evidence of a crime, his name forever associated with a particularly infamous or brutal case. To be named in the chronicles was to be shamed in them, his identity preserved only as a stain on the historical page. While the official scribes ignored him, the torturer did achieve a different kind of immortality, a legacy in the oral tradition, in the whispers and warnings of the common folk. He was the local bogeyman, the monster in the stories parents told their children to make them behave. Be good, or the man from the dungeon will get you. He was a creature of folklore, a specter of fear that haunted the collective imagination of his community long after he was dead. His name, if it was remembered at all, became a local curse word. This legacy of loathing was the primary and perhaps only inheritance he could pass on to his children. He could not leave them a good name or an honorable reputation. Instead, he bequeathed to them a surname that was synonymous with pain and disgrace. The name Sanson in France became inextricably linked with the guillotine. The name Schmidt in Nuremberg was, for a time, the mark of the executioner's caste. This was his gift to his descendants, a legacy of infamy that would shadow their lives and limit their futures for generations. The physical artifacts he left behind were equally tainted. Stonemasons could point to the soaring arches of a cathedral and say, "My father helped build that." The torturer's son could only point to a blood-stained rack gathering dust in a dark cellar. His legacy was not a proud creation, but a collection of grim and terrifying objects. His house on the edge of town would be remembered as a place of horror, his tools as objects of morbid fascination. These were the only monuments to his life's work. This contrast with an honorable craftsman is a stark one. A blacksmith forges tools that build a community: plowshares, horseshoes, nails. His work creates and sustains life. The torturer, by contrast, was an artisan of destruction. His craft was the unmaking of men. While the blacksmith legacy was in the homes and farms he helped build, the torturer's legacy was in the broken bodies, the ruined lives, and the grieving families he left in his wake. One built a community, the other was tasked with policing it by tearing it apart. Even in death, he could not escape his dishonorable status. An honorable Christian could expect to be buried in the churchyard, in consecrated ground, among their family and neighbors. The torturer, however, was often denied this final comfort. He would likely be buried in an unconsecrated plot of land outside the cemetery, perhaps near the gallows where he worked, alongside the criminals he had executed. His final indignity was a burial that confirmed his lifelong status as an outcast, separated from the community of the faithful even in his final rest. The ultimate example of the struggle against this legacy is the story of Meister Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg. His life's great ambition was not to be a renowned executioner, but to escape the shame of his profession. After a long and dutiful career, he spent his retirement petitioning the Holy Roman Emperor to have his family's name officially restored to the roles of honorable citizens. He eventually succeeded. His greatest victory was not in the execution of some notorious criminal, but in the complete and total erasure of his professional legacy, thereby freeing his children from the curse of his name. The Sanson dynasty in France presents a different side of this coin. They were far more famous than Schmidt, serving as the state executioners for over 150 years. They were well paid and centrally located in Paris. Yet, they were still trapped in a gilded cage of infamy. They achieved a form of legacy. Their name is known to history, but it is a legacy forever bound to the grim mechanics of the guillotine and the reign of terror. It is a legacy of state-sanctioned death, not of personal honor or achievement. For a man living in a deeply religious age, the judgment of history was secondary to a far more terrifying prospect: the final judgment of God. The torturer lived in a world where the reality of heaven and hell was absolute. He had to grapple with the terrifying certainty that upon his death he would stand before his Maker and account for every act of cruelty, every scream he had caused, every life he had helped to end. The terror he inflicted on earth was but a shadow of the eternal terror he likely feared for himself. What possible defense could he offer? He could plead that he was merely following the orders of the judges and princes, that he was a reluctant instrument of the law. But religious doctrine, then as now, emphasizes personal accountability for one's sins. The excuse, "I was just doing my job," would likely ring hollow when the job itself was the methodical brutalization of God's children. His spiritual dread was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, a private torment that would follow him to his grave and, he feared, beyond. And what of his legacy in our time, in the modern world? How do we remember him? The simple answer is, we don't. History remembers the kings who gave the orders, the rebels who were executed, and the inquisitors who passed judgment. The torturer himself remains almost entirely anonymous, a generic, hooded figure symbolizing the brutality of a bygone era. His final, ultimate erasure from the historical record is perhaps the most telling aspect of his legacy. He was so reviled that history has barely seen fit to remember he was ever a person at all. This, then, is the ultimate indignity, the final and most profound reason it sucked to be a medieval torturer. A man could endure a life of filth, danger, and social hatred. He could weather the psychological storms of his horrific work, but to do all that, only to have your legacy be one of utter loathing, or even worse, complete and total obscurity, is a uniquely miserable fate. His reward for a lifetime of grim and thankless service was to be either remembered as a monster or, more often, to not be remembered at all. Let us sum up the life of this miserable figure. He worked in a filthy, pestilent environment. He was hated and feared by the very society he served, forced to live as an outcast. He was a man whose career could be ended overnight by the shifting winds of politics or philosophy. He lived with the constant threat of violent retribution. His work eroded his own mind, forcing him to choose between madness and a soul-crushing numbness, and his only legacy was infamy. The true tragedy of the medieval torturer is not that he was some cackling, inhuman monster, but that he was almost always a man, trapped by birth or by circumstance in a monstrous role. He was a human being forced to spend his life perpetrating inhuman acts, and in doing so, he had his own humanity stripped away. First, it was taken by his profession, and then it was erased forever by history. That is the ultimate indignity, to be made a monster and then to be remembered as nothing else. And so we come to the end of our journey into one of history's most dreadful professions. We have walked the cold, damp corridors of the dungeon. We have stood beside the rack, and we have peered into the tormented soul of the man tasked with inflicting agony. We set out to understand why it truly sucked to be a medieval torturer, and after examining the evidence from every angle, the conclusion is as clear as it is grim. This was not merely a bad job, it was a life sentence of misery, a particular and peculiar hell on earth, designed for the purveyor of pain himself. We've seen the physical reality of his workplace, a subterranean office devoid of light and fresh air, permanently steeped in a miasma of mildew, filth, and fear. The stench of sweat, blood, and human waste was the air he breathed, a constant, suffocating perfume that clung to his clothes and skin. His work was not a matter of pushing papers, but of straining his own muscles against the resistance of human bodies, a physically exhausting and viscerally disgusting form of manual labor. His was a world of perpetual dampness, darkness, and decay. Beyond the filth of his chamber was the profound toxicity of his social life. As a member of the Dishonorable, he was a pariah and untouchable. He was a vital gear in the machine of the state, yet he was reviled by the very community he served. He was feared in the streets, shunned at the market, and barred from the warmth of the tavern and the comfort of the church. This stigma was a hereditary disease, infecting his wife and children, trapping them in the same inescapable prison of isolation. He was utterly, completely alone. And what of his mind? We have explored the unwinnable war that raged within his skull. To survive, he had to either build a callus over his soul, becoming an unfeeling automaton, or risk shattering completely into madness. He was an expert in a system he knew produced lies, a craftsman of false confessions. This daily participation in a dishonest and brutal charade fostered a deep cynicism and a moral injury that could never truly heal. His nightmares were likely far more vivid and terrifying than those of his victims. Furthermore, his life was one of constant precarity. He was a symbol of oppression, making him a prime target for angry mobs during uprisings and for vengeful families seeking personal retribution. His job security was non-existent, dependent entirely on the shifting whims of legal theory and the political climate. A new ruler or a new philosophy could render his unique and terrible skill set obsolete overnight, leaving him unemployed, unemployable, and forever branded by his monstrous reputation. After enduring all of this, the filth, the isolation, the psychological torment, and the danger, what was his reward? What was his legacy? It was one of ultimate indignity. Unlike the knights and kings he served, his name was not recorded for honor. He was remembered in whispers and warnings, a local bogeyman, or he was simply forgotten, an anonymous functionary of cruelty. His life's work earned him nothing but a legacy of loathing and a place in the unmarked grave of history's monsters. So as our time in the dungeon comes to a close, take a moment to look around you. Be grateful for your economic chair, for the clean air you breathe, for coffee that doesn't taste faintly of despair. Be grateful for colleagues who don't spend their days methodically dislocating limbs, and for a job where the worst hazard might be a paper jam. Because being a medieval torturer that truly, horrifyingly, and in a way almost hilariously, sucked on every conceivable level. Thank you for joining me on this grim exploration into the dark corners of history. I hope it has been as illuminating as it has been unsettling. May your night be peaceful, and may your dreams be entirely free from the sound of screaming and the sight of rusty instruments. Sleep well.